Sure, yeah, it said that.
Let's see.
The hunt is on for a serial killer who's preying on young men. Investigators have a plan to catch him, but will he take the bait?
Made a contact.
At first, it looked like a bungled burglary, but Maryland detectives could see the motive was murder. To solve it, they must establish which clues are real. Industrial parks in western Florida have become a killer's dumping ground. How many more women will die before authorities put him out of business? For some people, killing might come easy, but getting away with it seldom is. No matter how a murderer tries to cover his crimes, there will always be something left at the scene. Charlotte County, Florida, April 17, 1996. Two county road inspectors took a break from their duties to set up hog traps along a popular but secluded hunting trail.
Man,
What they found were the remains of someone else's
that
prey,
ain't what we're looking for.
a human skull. They notified the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. It was up to the forensics team to gather together what time and animals had scattered through the woods. Besides more remains, they looked for clothing, a weapon, or anything else that might help them determine the identity of the victim and how he or she came to be there. All investigators found was a single pink fiber near the skull. But it paled in comparison to what was discovered next. 50 yards from where the skull was found, an investigator spotted a roll of carpet padding. Inside was a male body, but it wasn't the body he expected to find. This one had a head. He was a second victim, more recent than the first, probably killed within the last few days. Less compromised by the elements, this second victim provided a second opportunity for usable clues. Rope fibers clung to a nearby tree, and additional lengths of rope were found strewn in the woods. A single tiny paint chip was lifted off the body. According to Jim Myers of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, these murder scenarios are the hardest kind of cases to solve.
It's not like a traditional crime where, you're in a house or whatever and you've got credit cards, you can find out who that is, do associates, neighborhood checks, and that type of thing. It doesn't work that way when you just get a body out in the woods.
A few feet from the first victim's skull, investigators found what remained of his torso. Though the body was badly decomposed, they were able to discern an unusual tattoo on his shoulder. It was their only hope of identifying him. Authorities relied on the media for help. That night, the news broadcast a photo of the tattoo, hoping someone might recognize it and identify the victim. Someone did. A woman phoned the police and said it looked like the tattoo worn by her brother, 25-year-old Kenny Smith. She told authorities that she hadn't heard from him in some time. Though he lived much of the time on the street, he'd recently seen the dentist, who provided up-to-date dental records. From them, investigators confirmed the remains found in the woods were Kenny Smith's.
Yes.
Investigators still had the other victim found in the carpet padding to identify. At autopsy, the body was determined to be a white male in his 20s. No one had reported anyone matching his description as missing in the county. The body was vacuumed to collect stray fibers and other trace evidence that might be clinging to it. Then the body was examined. Ligature marks scarred it in several places, mostly around his neck and genital region. He had been strangled to death by rope. Afterward, the killer had removed his genitals with a scalpel or sharp knife. Clearly the act of a twisted yet methodical mind. The victim had been dead approximately 1 day, and his fingerprints were still readable. From them, he was determined to be 21-year-old Richard Montgomery.
It's in there.
All right, looks good.
Montgomery and Smith were not the first young white males found dead in the woods of southwest Florida.
Yo, Rick, looks like we got something over here.
Okay, hold on.
Between 1994 and 1996, 3 others had been found in the woods of Charlotte and Sarasota counties. Fearing they were dealing with a serial killer, Chief Investigator Rick Hobbs called in a criminal profiler.
He reviewed the evidence that we had and basically confirmed that he, in his opinion, he felt that the same person was responsible for all these murders. And he described the person as possibly a sexual sadist.
Someone was preying on male drifters. And like some of his victims, he had no name. Because his latest victims were found on the hog hunting trail, the press called him the Hog Trail Killer. To coordinate efforts across jurisdictions, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement formed a task force with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Department and the Northport Police. Special Agent Jim Myers led the task force. They hadn't a minute to waste.
We're talking with a person that basically is on keep killing unless we stop them, and that's the primary reason to get a task force. We have the situation we had to get as many people as we could involved to prevent it from happening again. You know, our primary mission is to get the bad guy, but what we also have to do is protect the public safety.
The mysterious serial killings received wide publicity. Soon, it paid off. Donald Perry, an inmate at a state prison in Florida, had seen a news report and told authorities he might have been a potential victim of the killer. Perry said that a man approached him in a park and offered him $150 to pose nude in the woods. He said the pictures would involve bondage, that he'd be tied to a tree. They'd be Polaroids, so he wouldn't have to worry about the negatives being sold. The man, whose name was Dan, seemed very gentle, and Perry needed the money, so he took the job. On the way to the woods, the car got stuck in the mud on a secluded road. Some passers-by helped them free it while Perry steered.
All right, come on, let's go.
That was when Perry noticed the kit Dan had prepared for the photo shoot. The ropes, knife, and gloves made him fear for his life. As soon as the car was freed, Perry hit the gas.
Glasses was the guy I saw on TV.
A few hours later, he was arrested for stealing it. The scenario fit the profile closely enough for investigators to check the theft report. Investigators learned the theft report was filed by a man named Daniel Conahan and his father, who owned the vehicle. The task force took the lead and ran with it. They set up surveillance on Conahan. The 43-year-old registered nurse lived with his parents in Charlotte County. His nursing training recalled the clinical precision the killer used to mutilate one of the victims. Police photographed Conahan talking to and following drifters in his car. That was no crime. However, it was suspicious, and for the task force, an opportunity. They sent an undercover officer to pose as a decoy. They met several times as the decoy built Conahan's trust. The detective wore a body wire to record their conversations. Conahan eventually asked the detective to pose for pictures in the woods. Hoping Conahan would open up and say more, the undercover detective asked him to his camp in the woods, which was already staked out by a SWAT team. The detective had his agenda to gather evidence. But Conahan didn't cooperate. As the detective continued asking questions, Conahan lost interest. Investigators came away with only circumstantial evidence and nothing to warrant an arrest. If Daniel Conahan was a sadistic serial killer, he remained free to stalk new prey.
Last week on the 16th.
Police in Florida were on the trail of Daniel Conahan, suspected serial killer. But they had no real evidence. In June, 2 months after the last two murders were discovered, a Fort Myers police officer recalled a case from 3 years earlier. It was similar to an incident recently reported by an inmate named Donald Perry. Once again, it was a prisoner who held the key. Stanley Burden, serving time in Ohio, had a story to tell.
What happened to you?
I'll tell you about it.
It had a familiar ring.
Somewhere the other night outside
He said that he'd met a man outside a hamburger joint in Fort Myers who offered him money to be tied up in the woods and photographed. He said the guy's name was Dan. Needing the cash, Burden consented. Dan asked him to remove some clothes and then began tying him to a tree with clothesline he cut with a pair of pliers. The situation quickly spun out of control. Once Burden was immobilized, Dan began tightening the ropes around his neck. When they were sufficiently tight, Dan left him and never returned. Burden eventually freed himself. He was able to describe Dan's car, and more importantly, he picked Dan Conahan's picture out of a photo lineup. Based on this, investigators were able to arrest Conahan for the assault and attempted murder of Stanley Burden.
Basically a great relief for us at the task force because we was able to get him off the street earlier by the crime that he committed on Burton and be able to proceed in putting our cases together on the murders.
Investigators were a long way from proving Conahan was the serial killer they were looking for. That required more tangible proof. They obtained a warrant to search the home he shared with his parents. Forensic examiners collected fibers from carpets, bedding, and furniture. Each specimen was carefully tagged, packaged, and sent off to the crime lab for analysis. Conahan's automobile was searched as well. Besides an assortment of carpet and upholstery fibers, technicians also collected a chip of paint from the car's peeling exterior. They needed to compare it to the one found on the body of Richard Montgomery, one of the two young men found along the hog trail. Hoping to find more incriminating evidence against their suspect, investigators subpoenaed Conahan's credit card records for the previous 3 years. To investigators, Items listed on the statements suggested Conahan was stocking and restocking a murder kit.
On the 16th of April, we found where just before Mr. Montgomery disappeared, some of the items, pliers, rope, knife, and I believe a tarp, was purchased that afternoon.
The items were purchased at a store just down the street from where Richard Montgomery lived. While the credit card records were being scrutinized, the fiber and paint samples were analyzed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab. Several fibers collected from Conahan's house matched fibers gathered at the crime scene. Next, the paint chip from Conahan's car was analyzed to see if it matched the chip found clinging to one of the victims. A tiny chip of paint can hold volumes of information. First, it's looked at to determine how many layers of paint are present, their colors, and their thickness. Both the sample from the car and the specimen from the murder scene consisted of 4 layers of paint of matching colors and thickness. Microanalyst Jan Taylor needed to determine if the 2 chips chemically matched.
In doing my microchemical examinations, I take small peels of each layer within the paint sample and apply a solvent or reagent to it to see how the paint reacts to the solvent or reagent. And I perform this on the question paint recovered from the victim as well as the known paint samples removed from the vehicle. And in doing so, I did determine that these paints indeed were like one another at this step of my examination.
And that brought detectives one step closer to making their case against Conahan. But still not close enough. Taylor had more work to do. She used infrared radiation to analyze the chemical binders in the paint samples. Then, a scanning electron microscope revealed the pigments. In a process called energy dispersive X-ray analysis, the samples are bombarded with X-rays, causing them to throw off electrons. These electrons reveal the elements that the paint pigments are made from. In all these tests, the paint chips matched.
The conclusion that I reached following these tests were that the question paint chip removed from the victim originated from this vehicle.
The paint chip found on Richard Montgomery's body had come from Daniel Conahan's car. Science had made its case against Conahan. According to the evidence, Conahan lured Richard Montgomery into the woods for a bogus photo shoot. Once he had Montgomery where he wanted him, Conahan tortured and killed him. The jury deliberated only around 20 minutes before sentencing the Hog Trail killer to death. Daniel Conahan sought out his victims and lured them to their deaths. Other killers are less meticulous. They strike closer to home and kill on the spot. 70 miles from Baltimore, Hagerstown, Maryland is a typical American community and a good place to raise kids. A place where some folks don't feel the need to lock their doors, at least most of the time. On Valentine's Day, 1995, Deborah and Tim Massey's twin sons came home from school and found themselves locked out. That was unusual. Deborah was always home to greet her 8-year-olds. They went to the garage behind their house where their father, Tim Massey, ran a towing company. Their dad wasn't around, so they asked an employee, Darrell Mosier, if he'd seen their mother. He took the boys back to the house and tried knocking. He got no response.
Deborah?
The broken window caused him some concern.
Hey, let's go on over to Grandma's house.
Well, how are you? So good.
Tim Massey was out on a job, So Mosier brought the boys to their grandmother, who lived nearby.
They said they couldn't get in the house.
She called Deborah's house. Still no answer.
Thank you.
Sensing that something had to be wrong, Darrell Mosier returned to the house and entered. And there he found Deborah Massey collapsed on the living room floor. She wasn't breathing. He phoned the police.
Hagerstown City Police.
He reported that someone appeared to have broken in, but the doors were still locked. Detective George Brandt of the Hagerstown Police questioned that scenario.
We were advised that all the doors were locked, both the front door and the back doors of the residence. And we thought that was odd. I mean, somebody go ahead and murder someone and leave the residence and locking the doors.
Deborah Massey always left the doors open so that her kids could get in when they came home from school. The locked doors were just the first of several strange clues investigators found. The next clue was attached to the television, where forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval found a strange note.
It said, "Your husband is next. I need money." Now, here we have someone writing a note to a dead person, a person that they had just killed. It would make more sense if they were writing the note to the husband to say, "You are next," and give their name. For example, Tim. "Tim, you are next. I need money."
But whoever scribbled this bizarre note to a dead woman apparently didn't need money that badly after all. He'd ransacked the house, but left behind the victim's jewelry and even some cash. This bungled burglary was looking more like a sloppy murder in disguise. Maryland investigators on the scene of a murder initially believed the motive was robbery. But on closer inspection, it seemed nothing of value had been taken. Along with fiber samples, they picked up shards of glass from the broken window. A cigarette butt was collected from a trash can. Mrs. Massey was not a smoker. The house had no ashtrays, lighters, matches, or cigarettes.
Sent that off to the Secret Service.
Investigators believe that the killer must have left this cigarette butt behind. Deborah Massey, who had recently filed for divorce from her husband, Tim, lived in the house with her twins. By all accounts, she was a devoted mom who stayed active in her children's lives. Though Tim Massey had moved to an apartment, he still operated the towing service out of the backyard of the house. While the crime scene was being investigated, detectives reviewed Darrell Mosier's statement. Mosier claimed that Tim Massey arrived for work at around 10:30 a.m., stayed about 10 minutes, then left. Around 11:45, Massey returned. Mosier saw him walking towards the house. Mosier said that Massey returned a few minutes later. They spoke briefly, and then Massey left again. Mosier left for lunch shortly thereafter. Mosier said he didn't see Deborah at all. An examination of the property demonstrated that the only way to get to the back door was to pass by the garage. Mosier said he saw nobody pass there except for Tim Massey. But Massey never stayed for any length of time.
So what I'll do is
A check of Mosier's statement established his whereabouts for the entire day and dismissed him as a suspect.
Thank you.
So whatever happened at the Massey house happened while Mosier was away for lunch. At the killer's point of entry, investigators found a toolbox. Inside was a hammer with glass particles clinging to it, probably used to break the window. As the investigation at the house continued, Tim Massey arrived. He said his mother contacted him when Darrell Mosier brought the kids over and said that the house had been broken into. Police informed him of his wife's murder and took him to the station for questioning. As a husband going through a bitter divorce, Tim Massey was automatically a suspect, especially since he was seen at the house that morning. He cooperated fully with police. He handed over the contents of his pockets, which included ink pens. He gave them his clothes for forensic analysis. It was standard procedure for proving someone's innocence. Tim Massey acknowledged that the couple had a rocky relationship. Deborah had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier and had also filed a protective order against Tim. He and his employees were not allowed in the home.
7 o'clock.
What time did you go to Bob's?
7.
Massey stated that he'd been at the garage once that morning. He went to check on one of the twins who'd been sick.
And, what time did you do?
The information helped Detective George Brandt piece together Massey's whereabouts that morning.
11:15.
So he was interested in the one boy, seeing how he was doing. And of course he learned when he got there, and this was between 10 and 10:30 that morning, that his boy had gone to school and he was doing all right.
So, Mr. Massey, can you tell me where you were?
He told police that Deborah had met him on the porch.
What time did you get there?
Massey insisted he hadn't been inside the house in weeks. After leaving the house, he went to one of the police impound lots that he towed vehicles to. Around 1 o'clock, Massey called the police to report that someone had stolen the wheels off one of the cars he was storing for the police. The officer met him at the lot at 1:18.
People come out here, take all my stuff.
They were there until 1:50, when they both went to the police station. Massey was friendly with the police because he did some towing work for them. He said he wanted to go to the station to say hello.
And I imagine he was in here for a good half hour, maybe a little longer, just talking to people down there on the first floor.
We already interviewed.
Investigators had to consider that Deborah Massey was killed randomly by a stranger. According to Detective Bill Rourke, investigators hit the streets to see if anyone could report anything suspicious.
We did neighborhood canvasses. Anyone who saw anything unusual was brought into police headquarters and a statement was obtained from them. All of Mr. Massey's employees were brought into police headquarters and statements were obtained from them. We interviewed family members. We interviewed anyone at all who was willing to talk to us, who had any information at all.
Despite their efforts, police turned up nothing. Nobody had any useful information to share. No one had seen anything suspicious. While police canvassed neighborhoods, Deborah Massey underwent an autopsy. Examiners concluded that she was murdered sometime between 11:15 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. From the markings on her throat, it was clear that she was manually strangled to death.
Strangulation. And based on
Forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval noticed something significant about the markings.
my pleasure.
I had investigated 2 other cases involving manual strangulation within the past 6 months. And in all those cases, there were tiny crescent-shaped abrasions over the surface of the neck and the face area where the individual had used their hands to strangle them. In this case, with Debbie Massey, none of those markings were present. And in the interview room with Mr. Massey, I noted that he was a nail biter and had very, very short fingernails.
11:15, 11.
Nail biting is not a punishable offense, and it certainly didn't prove Tim Massey was the killer.
Mr. Massey, could you stand up and...
Investigators looked for every possible way to eliminate him as a suspect. But Tim Massey couldn't account for all of his movements during the time in which the murder had occurred. They felt there were too many unanswered questions regarding Tim Massey. They hoped to find answers at his apartment.
Mr. Massey, could we have your clothes?
Investigators believed that Tim Massey might know more about his wife's murder than he was letting on. He gave his consent to search his apartment. In the hamper, investigators recovered a pair of trousers, In the cuffs were small fragments of glass. This was the first piece of incriminating evidence against Tim Massey. When he had arrived at the house, officers kept him at a safe distance to prevent contamination of the crime scene. It was unlikely that he came in contact with the glass on the porch at that time. But for the fragments found on his pants to be true physical evidence, they needed to be tested. The fibers and the glass collected from the pants were compared against samples taken from the murder scene. They matched. The lab also tested the ink from the pens that Massey handed over during his interview.
Whenever a manufacturer manufactures a new lot of ink, they send a representative sample to the Secret Service. At that particular point in time, they had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 different inks in their reference library.
The ink on the note matched none of the database samples, suggesting that it was a generic brand. The odds of matching it to a specific pen grew even slimmer than 7,000 to 1. And yet, one of Tim Massey's pens had exactly the same chemical characteristics as the ink on the note found at the scene. But the most indelible mark of Massey's guilt was the freshly smoked cigarette found at the crime scene. It was Tim Massey's brand, and more precisely, his DNA was on it. That conclusively placed him at the scene and caught him in a blatant lie.
Mr. Massey continuously denied that he was in the house during this day or for several weeks prior to that. If he would have placed himself in the house, that would have not been strange to us due to the fact he used to be married to the lady, they were going through a divorce, and he had 2 children that lived there. But he was adamant that he had not been in the house.
Not only had Tim Massey been there that day, he also killed there. On September 20th, 1995, Tim Massey was arrested for the murder of his wife, Deborah. From what police could determine, Massey, who was seeing another woman, realized that if Deborah divorced him, she would be entitled to half of his assets, including the towing business he had built from scratch. It would mean selling the business and starting over. Massey had a different plan. Sometime between noon and 1 p.m., Massey entered his wife's house through the unlocked door and strangled her. Then he wrote the note and staged the robbery. He knew his kids would come home from school, and he didn't want them to find their mother's body, so he locked the door on his way out. He broke the window to simulate a break-in. More locked doors awaited Timothy Massey, who was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Tim Massey tried to disguise his crime through a series of false clues. Other killers spend their time trying to erase any trace evidence at the scene. But it's only a matter of time before the clues they leave behind catch up with them. Pinellas County is a small southern peninsula jutting out of Florida's western flank. It's home to the resort and fishing community of Clearwater. It was also the site of a series of grisly murders. On October 20th, 1995, a delivery person discovered the nude body of a woman outside an industrial park. Police arrived at the scene and began to gather clues. But few were found. The victim's clothing and jewelry were gone, and though marks on her wrists and ankles suggested she'd been tied up at some point, no rope was found. Bruises to her body indicated she'd been beaten, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Lack of footprints and broken vegetation suggested she was killed elsewhere and her body hidden here. The ground did hold a tire impression. Investigators had no guarantee that the killer's vehicle had made it, but the possibility couldn't be overlooked. Plaster was poured over the impression to make a cast for further analysis. At autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Animal hairs were recovered from the body. A few tiny synthetic fibers also were retrieved. None of this would be of any use unless a suspect surfaced. The victim's fingerprints were run through the police database. She was 42-year-old Wendy Ann Evans, who had a record for drugs.
So how long has your mother been missing?
Evans had come to Clearwater to be with her daughter.
When did she?
She's had a bad life.
The victim's daughter told investigators that her mother had been going through some hard times.
I would say approximately.
The victim's father had just died. She'd been trying to kick her drug habit, and she believed her cancer was recurring. A few days before her death, she'd even checked herself into a psychiatric facility to cope with her depression. She wanted desperately to pull her life together. But her luck took a fatal turn for the worse. 3 weeks later, at another industrial area, another nude female body was found.
Call came in, 6210 for ID just arrived. Check this out.
Like Wendy Ann Evans, this victim had been bound and beaten, then left in a secluded spot. Again, there were no signs of sexual assault. The similarities between the two cases defied coincidence. Both were found in industrial areas within 10 miles of each other. The latest victim was identified by police records as 40-year-old Peggy Darnell, a prostitute from Clearwater. Sergeant Mike Ring worked the case.
We had no physical evidence from that scene because of the decomposition of the body. We had no hairs, no fibers, no footprints, no tire tracks that were of any value to the investigation.
Nevertheless, investigators suspected the same person was responsible for both murders. And these might not have been the killer's first victims. A check of police records revealed a third victim. 15 months earlier, a prostitute named LaDonna Steller was found murdered. Except for the span of time, the details were eerily familiar.
All three women were white females. They'd all been found nude, no jewelry or clothing on any of the bodies. And the cause of death, at least on Steller and Evans, was manual strangulation with some physical beating.
The only crime scene to provide potential forensic evidence was the murder of Wendy Ann Evans. Detective Tom Klein of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department tried to make the most of the scant clues.
The tire track had been sent off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for analysis. The fibers were being analyzed at FDLE. We were consistently talking to the prostitutes in the area and trying to make contact with their Johns. So we were keeping very busy.
And so was the killer. In January 1996, 3 months after Wendy Ann Evans was killed, the body of 27-year-old Cindy Pugh was discovered behind a dumpster. Its location was halfway between where the two other victims were found. And like them, she was nude and had been strangled. If any doubt about a serial killer remained, the murder of Cindy Pugh erased it. The sheets that authorities used to wrap the victims were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab in Tampa Bay. There, they were carefully swept. Anything falling off of them was collected on a crimped sheet of butcher paper called a debris fold. Microanalyst Jerry Serino looked for trace evidence among the debris.
When using a stereo microscope to actually sift through the debris, it's a very time-consuming and slow process.
It was time well spent. Among the debris collected from the Wendy Ann Evans murder, Serino found 4 pink carpet fibers. They matched the carpet fibers found on Cynthia Pugh. More animal hairs were also found. They were sent off for further analysis. Cynthia Pugh's body also had a tiny shred of cigarette filter paper clinging to it. The trace evidence proved that the women were the victims of the same killer, but it brought authorities no closer to finding who that killer was. He was free to keep on killing. Investigators formed a task force to alert potential victims and to monitor the area where the prostitutes worked. Meanwhile, in another department of the FDLE, senior analyst Oral Woods studied the tire tread lifted from the first murder scene.
I was looking for a particular tire with a similar tread design. Once I found that similar tread design in my tire guidebook, I was able then to determine it was a Firestone Radial ATX tire.
A check with the manufacturer revealed that the tire was made for light trucks, but few were sold. In fact, they'd stopped making it 3 years earlier.
We asked them to pull up any inventory that would reflect sales of this particular size and style tire, and they were able to show that there was only one set of 4 tires sold in the Tampa Bay metropolitan area in the previous 3 years.
The manufacturer gave investigators the name of the dealer, who in turn told them who purchased the tires, someone named Terry Howard. Detectives began surveillance at Howard's home and discovered that she was a woman. Someone was killing women in Florida, and investigators' only clue was a tire tread. It brought them to the home of a woman named Terry Jo Howard. She owned a light truck, like the one they were looking for. But it was driven mainly by a man who lived with her.
We didn't have him identified. We had no idea who he was. His name wasn't on any of the leases, wasn't on any of the telephone subscriptions or power subscriptions.
He was put on separate surveillance and was eventually identified as a window installer named James Randall. Investigators' efforts were beginning to pay off.
Once we had Randall identified, we started an in-depth background on him. We found out all about his previous arrests in Massachusetts, the fact that there were outstanding warrants for him for violating his parole, the previous history of him being a suspect in a murder in Massachusetts.
Randall certainly fit the mold for a murder suspect, and the surveillance revealed that the tires on his girlfriend's truck were the same type found at the murder scene. But investigators needed hard evidence. Then they got a break. During the surveillance, Randall pulled into a tire store and had 2 of the truck tires replaced. Police obtained the old ones from the dealer. But it wasn't enough. Their tire expert needed all 4 to make the comparison against the cast from the crime scene. Investigators came up with a plan. First, they purchased a new set of tires to switch with the ones on Randall's truck.
We then had the manager at the tire store contact Terry Jo Howard and told her that the 2 tires that he put on her truck were defective, and if she took the time to bring her truck in, he would give her 4 brand new tires for free. She couldn't come quick enough. She came in, she exchanged the tires, and now we had all 4 tires.
The tire expert determined that one of the tires from Randall's truck was consistent with the impression left at Wendy Ann Evans' murder scene. Not only were the manufacturer's tread patterns the same, but more important, the nicks, abrasions, and wear patterns also matched. Like a fingerprint, these characteristics are unique to every tire. That proved that the truck was there, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was there at the time of the murder. Randall could have driven his truck there days or mere minutes before the crime occurred. Investigators needed proof. They needed physical evidence that directly linked him to the victims. But they still didn't have probable cause to get a search warrant for his house. The stray hairs on both Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh's bodies were determined to be dog hair. Randall's girlfriend, Terry Jo Howard, owned a dog. Investigators needed a sample of its fur to make the comparison. But how?
And we came up with the idea of using this female sergeant and one of our other female detectives to pose as mobile dog groomers.
They made up flyers to hand out and post around the neighborhood. They included a phone number and announced they'd be going door to door offering their grooming service. To make the ruse legal, the police had to offer the same service to everyone in the neighborhood. Fortunately, no one else took them up on their offer. They arrived at Terry Joe Howard's home while James Randall was at work. Terry Joe welcomed them in.
We can take her right outside, right out front.
Things went better than expected. There on the floor was a mauve rug, the possible source of the fibers found on the two bodies. The officers washed the pet. They used sterile towels to dry it and collect samples of its fur. The analysis of the dog hairs indicated they matched the ones from the crime scenes. Now, detectives had the tires and the dog hair to tie James Randall to the slayings. But prosecutors felt they still didn't have grounds for a warrant. It was time to pull out their ace in the hole. By living in Florida, Randall was violating his parole in Massachusetts.
That'll do it? Okay.
I'll give it later on.
Okay.
On June 26, 1996, 8 months after the first murder, Pinellas County deputies went to arrest Randall so authorities could keep an eye on him while they built their homicide case. But it wasn't as simple as that. At the sight of the deputies, Randall sped off, racing through a neighborhood before abandoning his truck and fleeing on foot. He managed to scale a fence and vanish into a densely wooded area. Authorities mounted a massive search, but Randall eluded them. They were confident he'd try to make contact with his girlfriend.
Wondering if you had heard anything or seen anything.
I think I'd read about...
They went to Terry Joe Howard's house to gauge her knowledge of the crimes. It was the first time they'd contacted her directly. When the police informed her of Randall's criminal record and told her that he was a suspect, she cooperated completely.
Canvassing the area to see if there was anybody
And so
that
did
heard
her
anything
dog.
about the brutal murders that occurred.
One of the things that they noticed was that Terry Joe Howard's dog was always hacking up and spitting. And when he'd hack up and spit, there would be these pieces of paper. And we found out later on that this dog liked to eat cigarette butts out of the ashtray.
Investigators recalled that a tiny piece of cigarette filter paper was collected from the body of Cynthia Pugh. Terry told police that she was the smoker. She consented to give a blood sample so that her DNA could be compared to that found on the crime scene cigarette paper. She also allowed investigators to take her mauve rug to be analyzed. The rug was analyzed and found to contain several kinds of fibers. With the whole rug at his disposal, Jerry Serino was able to get a more complete forensic picture. He compared the rug to fibers taken from victims Pugh and Evans.
I was able to say that those fibers could have come from this particular rug. If they did not come from this particular rug, they came from a rug that had the exact same characteristics that had an opportunity to come in contact with both Cynthia Pugh and Wendy Evans.
In the language of forensic fiber analysis, that's considered the closest thing to an exact match. But it was the DNA analysis that clinched the case. It linked the scrap of paper found on Cynthia Pugh to the cigarettes in the home of Terry Joe Howard and the suspect, James Randall. Randall, still on the lam, returned to the house 4 days after he fled. But when he saw detectives there, he took off again. This time, he didn't get away.
Right, again. Up, behind it.
Investigators believe that while Terry Joe Howard was out of town, he'd pick up prostitutes, bring them home, and kill them. But Randall was careful. Except for the scrap of cigarette paper, he left no DNA on his victims. He didn't need to. In April 1997, based on the forensic evidence, James Randall was convicted of second-degree murder for the killing of Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh. He was given 2 life sentences. Some killers choose a remote venue. Others doctor the site to conceal their presence. And some take great pains to leave no trace of themselves behind. In the end, it doesn't matter. If the killer has been there, forensics can find something they've left at the scene.